Establishing central presence immediately, this pawn stake aims to contest early territory and open lines for rapid development. Gambiting pawn territory so early disrupts piece development and potentially exposes your king. Developing a knight solidifies control, preparing for castling and anticipating black's aggressive opening strategy. Developing the knight here prepares for castling and supports the pawn structure, a logical continuation of the setup. Expanding central control, c4 now challenges black's aggressive pawn on f5 and prepares to assert dominion over crucial squares. Securing the dark squares with a fianchetto, black prepares a more active piece development. Preparing to develop the bishop, this move solidifies the center while allowing queenside piece activity to follow. Developing the bishop to its natural diagonal here is key, controlling the center and preparing for kingside castling. Expanding the queenside pawn structure creates significant space and pressure, aiming to disrupt black's kingside intentions. Challenging the queenside immediately creates dynamic pawn tension and opens a path for the rook. Challenging black's flank, this advance forcibly probes the stability of the queenside pawn structure, potentially isolating black's a pawn or forcing concessions. Unlocking the queenside's potential with that pawn push is a bold response, aiming to disrupt white's expansion and potentially create a passed pawn later, but it leaves the kingside's pawn structure somewhat compromised if white can exploit the weakened squares. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the long light square diagonal and potentially support a kingside attack later. Securing the king's safety is paramount after the pawns storm on the queenside, a sensible step to consolidate the position. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies central control, preparing to exert pressure on black's queenside expansion, while simultaneously supporting a potential kingside castling strategy that aims to link the rooks. Preparing to challenge white's queenside pawn chain, this move unlocks the c8 bishop and aims for a more dynamic pawn structure by potentially pushing e5 or c5 later on. Refocusing the bishop's gaze towards the kingside, this move prepares for a potential central pawn push and solidifies the knight's dominion on f3, anticipating black's pawn advances by securing that important diagonal. Developing the knight to d7 offers flexibility, preparing to contest the center more robustly and potentially reinforcing e5 or c5. It also keeps the queen's bishop's diagonal open for future development. Castling fortifies the monarch, bringing the rook into play and solidifying this flank. Shifting the queen to e7 readies it for a potential pawn push on the queenside, while also bolstering the e6 pawn and preparing to connect the rooks once the central tension resolves. Commanding the c-file opens up avenues for pressure, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the queenside. Solidifying the pawn chain's integrity, this advance reinforces the queenside structure against white's aggressive pawn storm and prepares to transfer pieces to potentially less contested sectors of the board, aiming for a more balanced development and perhaps to contest the central squares with renewed vigor. Initiating a knight repositioning, preparing to deploy the horse to a more active square, potentially targeting squares like d3 or f3, while simultaneously opening the path for the c-pawn to advance and gain further queenside space. Developing the bishop to b7 activates a piece that was previously somewhat passive on g7, creating a crucial diagonal that eyes the c6 square and subtly reinforces d6, offering better prospects for pawn structure resilience. Reinforcing the central pawn chain and preparing a potential kingside initiative, this bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, influencing the d6 pawn and eyeing potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure around the kingside. The knight bravely ventures to e4, a centralizing thrust that immediately challenges white's queenside pawn structure and creates potential tactical skirmishes around the d2 and c3 squares. This move injects dynamism into the position, forcing white to consider immediate responses to prevent further intrusion or to exploit the knight's advanced placement. It's a commitment to active piece play, seeking to disrupt white's seemingly solid development and potentially open lines for attack. Suddenly, white marshals their queen towards the queenside, a strategic pivot aiming to exploit the open b-file and prepare for potential pawn advances or piece pressure along that flank, while simultaneously reinforcing the d4 pawn and adding support to the knight on c3. Reconsolidating the knight to f6 secures the e4 outpost and prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while also preventing white's bishop on g7 from becoming too dominant. Swapping knights on d3 opens up the c-file for white's rook and aims to simplify the position while keeping queenside space. Shifting the rook to the open d-file immediately contests this crucial central artery, aiming to activate the piece from its previous passive post. Introducing a knight to the edge of the board, this maneuver aims to create unforeseen pressure on black's queenside structure, potentially forcing concessions in pawn structure or piece activity, as the knight prowls towards c5 or b6. Embarking on a daring kingside pawn thrust, 16, g5 aims to shatter white's central control and open lines towards the enemy king, a bold gambit in a position that has been characterized by careful maneuvering. This aggressive pawn push, while potentially creating weaknesses, seeks to seize initiative and disrupt white's harmonious development, particularly the advanced b5 pawn, which now faces increased pressure. The intention is to unbalance the position and exploit any hesitation from white to react decisively, potentially forcing concessions or creating tactical opportunities. Shifting the bishop to e2, white aims to reinforce the kingside defense, anticipating potential pawn storms from black. This repositioning also prepares for a future knight maneuver, perhaps to f2 or g3, bolstering the central control and offering an escape square for the king should the queenside defenses crack. The bishop's retreat acknowledges the aggressive posture black has adopted with the pawn advances, a tactical concession to secure the monarchy. Black's pawn push aggressively probes white's kingside, threatening to unravel the central structure and potentially open lines towards the beleaguered monarch. A bold attempt to shatter black's central pawn structure, opening lines at the cost of creating potential weaknesses on the queenside. The pawn storm on the kingside has been met with a counter-thrust in the center, a bold gambit of initiative for material, aiming to pry open lines for black's pieces. This aggressive advance on d5 is a direct challenge to white's central control, an attempt to inject chaos and force a concrete response before the queenside advance can truly solidify. It's a risky maneuver, potentially creating weaknesses in black's own pawn structure if white can expertly navigate the ensuing complications, but it undeniably injects dynamism into a position that was starting to feel rather static. A bold advance, this pawn thrust seizes territory and attempts to disrupt black's kingside structure, creating an immediate dilemma for the defender to decide whether to maintain the pawn chain or seek counterplay on the queenside, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. Initiating a counterattack on the queenside, black reroutes the bishop to its developing square, now poised to bolster the pawn structure and potentially exploit the newly created diagonal. Opening the central files and preparing to pressure black's isolated queenside pawns is the immediate goal, aiming to exploit the static weaknesses that have begun to form in black's pawn structure. Black's queen surges forward, a bold declaration of intent, seeking to disrupt white's meticulously constructed pawn chain and threaten the uncastled king's flank. This adventurous queen sortie sacrifices pawn structure for immediate activity, a gamble that could either unleash a devastating kingside attack or leave the monarch exposed to swift counterplay. Initiating a decisive counterattack on the kingside, nf4 boldly challenges black's advanced pawn structure and prepares to exploit the newly opened diagonals. The sacrifice of the knight opens up a dangerous diagonal for black's queen, directly threatening the weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially creating new avenues for attack. Unlocking the center with the pawn removal opens up critical diagonal lines for your pieces, particularly the queen and the fianchettoed bishop, while simultaneously creating a passed pawn on the c-file that will demand black's immediate attention. Unleashing the rook to its full potential often hinges on the adjacent pawns, and here black endeavors to activate the piece by offering it for exchange, seeking to break white's imposing pawn chain and open lines. This move concedes control of the important g3 square, potentially creating weaknesses around the king that black might exploit later in the game. The queen's sudden appearance on h3 dramatically alters the queenside initiative, aiming to exploit the now exposed kingside and potentially initiate a mating attack by creating new threats against the king. Seizing the initiative, white decisively sacrifices the bishop to rip open black's kingside defenses, creating immediate threats against the vulnerable monarch and disrupting black's previously solid pawn structure. Suddenly, the queen finds herself exposed, a tempting target amidst a landscape of pawns and knights. This capture, while regaining material, presents a dangerous tactical crossroads. The ensuing chaos could easily unravel black's defensive structure if not handled with extreme precision, potentially opening critical diagonals towards an already compromised monarch. Unleashing a pawn storm is a desperate gambit, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious development by forcing open lines towards the king. But it irrevocably weakens white's own royal sanctuary, creating potential targets on the newly exposed squares. The position is becoming very sharp, and black needs to be acutely aware of the open lines and potential weaknesses around their king. The decision to bring the queen back into the fray, while understandable for defensive reasons, does surrender some central control and potentially invites further complications. Consider the queen's current placement, which is rather exposed to immediate threats from white's developing pieces and pawn advances. It would be prudent to prioritize consolidating defenses and seeking counterplay that doesn't leave the monarch vulnerable. Opening the f-file grants significant attacking potential against black's exposed king, a direct consequence of black's aggressive but ultimately unsound pawn advances on the kingside. The black king's safety is now a major concern, as the central pawns have been exchanged, opening lines towards it. Opening the d-file with this pawn push shatters black's compact structure, creating immediate threats against the king and potentially exposing weak squares around it. Black seeks to unlock their cramped queenside and activate the bishop on g7, aiming for counterplay in the center by challenging white's central pawn mass. Shattering the center's stability, this exchange forces a radical reevaluation of pawn structures. White's intent is to open lines for immediate pressure, particularly against black's uncastled king. The immediate consequence is a compromised pawn phalanx for black, creating potential weaknesses that white can exploit with active piece play. Observe how this seemingly simple capture dramatically alters the landscape of the board, potentially leading to swift tactical skirmishes or a strategic pawn race. Returning the rook to the first rank with check abruptly halts white's promising pawn storm and injects immediate tactical urgency into the position, forcing a confrontation rather than allowing white to consolidate their central advantage. Reclaiming the open file after the exchange aims to pressure the weakened kingside and potentially activate the remaining rook, though it necessitates careful attention to the pawn structure's integrity and black's counterplay on the queenside. The pawn structure now crystallizes, creating a complex scenario where black attempts to reignite the center after white's aggressive pawn thrust. This move, accepting the exchange of material, seeks to liberate black's pieces and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it leaves the king somewhat exposed and the d-file a potential target for white's remaining forces. Unleashing the queen into the heart of black's position after the pawn sacrifice, white aims to exploit the newly opened diagonals and the exposed king. The critical pawn structure on the kingside is now irrevocably shattered, creating exploitable weaknesses that the queen can now target. Consider the immediate pressure on the g4 pawn. If it falls, the black king faces a direct assault. This audacious queen repositioning transforms the game from a tense positional struggle into a sharp tactical battle. Black must tread extremely carefully, as the queen's presence on c4 introduces a multitude of forcing lines and tactical threats. Seizing the initiative on the queenside, black's queen boldly infiltrates, aiming to destabilize white's central pawn structure and potentially unpin the knight. Reasserting central control and preparing for an advance on the kingside, the knight repositions itself to potentially support a pawn push or create attacking chances. Unleashing the queenside pawn storm has created a complex pawn structure, Now, the critical challenge is to navigate this intricate web and potentially exploit the exposed black king, all while avoiding positional concessions that could prove fatal later. Consolidating central control with this rook, repositioning aims to harness the open d-file, potentially pressuring black's king should it remain exposed, while also preparing to bring the queen back into the fray for active engagement. The advance of the e-pawn, now a passed pawn, drastically alters the dynamic, threatening to become a dangerous force if left unchecked, while simultaneously opening a pathway for black's queen to potentially join the attack. A bold territorial grab, the pawn advances to claim crucial squares and potentially stifle black's queen, aiming to lock down the queenside and reroute pieces to the central battlefront. A sudden gambit is on the cards, threatening to shatter white's pawn structure with a well-timed queen sacrifice. Unlocking the file for potential queen and rook activity, this maneuver seeks to exploit the exposed black king, which now finds itself increasingly vulnerable due to the pawn structure's collapse on the kingside. That bishop's descent to h3 marks a bold attempt to disrupt white's central pawn structure and create mating threats around the king. A tactical shot has just passed, leaving white with a precarious pawn structure, but the rook's relocation to the b-file aims to exploit the pressure on black's queenside and potentially launch an assault on the weak b3 square, forcing a difficult decision for black's remaining pieces. Plucking a pawn from the queen's flank now, after the rook exchange, significantly weakens white's queenside pawn structure and opens a pathway for black's queen to potentially infiltrate. This aggressive pawn grab, however, risks neglecting the central position and could leave the black king exposed if white can effectively exploit the open lines. It's a bold decision, prioritizing immediate material gain over positional solidity, and its success hinges on black's ability to navigate the resulting tactical complexities. The queen's sudden retreat to c4 aims to stabilize the shaky position and redeploy, perhaps to a more active square like e2 or even d3 if the opportunity arises, while also preventing any immediate black knight incursions on the queen's side. A desperate attempt to regroup, desperately clinging to the queen's defense while the open files threaten to overwhelm. The repositioning of the queen to the fourth rank initiates a sophisticated attempt to exploit the compromised central pawn structure and the exposed black king. The bishop's repositioning aims to challenge white's imposing pawn chain and potentially activate the dormant light-squared pieces, seeking to pry open lines for counterplay against the exposed white king. Reclaiming the contested central files offers a glimmer of hope for white, aiming to disrupt black's burgeoning queenside pressure and perhaps shore up the vulnerable king. Initiating a strategic regrouping and potential reinforcement of the central pawn, Mass offers a crucial defensive shield for the king, while simultaneously preparing for a more active role on the kingside. Unleashing the queen to the g-file, white seeks to exploit the exposed black monarch and create immediate threats, aiming to pierce through the weakened pawn structure around the king. The black bishop, having just returned to its starting square from the queenside, now seeks a new outpost on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's perceived tranquility and potentially add another attacker to the vicinity of white's uncastled monarch. The queen's foray to h4, while seemingly aggressive, risks overextension and leaves its king with fewer defenders amidst a developing pawn storm. A precarious repositioning of the queen, seeking a less exposed square amidst the mounting pressure, though it invites further complications on the weakened dark squares. A decisive exchange is initiated, simplifying the position and aiming to leverage the newly opened queen's file. The exchange of queens has steered the game toward a simpler, yet still complex endgame where pawn structure and piece activity will dictate the flow. Repositioning the knight to e2 aims to reinforce the kingside defenses, potentially preparing to reroute it to g3 or f4 to contest black's active pieces and alleviate the pressure on the f3 pawn. Opening the queenside flank with the pawn advance aims to create counterplay, potentially forcing white's pieces back and generating threats against the uncastled king if it were still on the kingside. But here, it's more about disrupting white's coordinated setup and gaining a foothold for black's rook or bishop on the now open file. Reclaiming the dark-squared bishop's diagonal after a forced exchange unlocks potential pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. Opening the A-file now allows black to activate the rook, immediately contesting the open column and potentially creating pressure on white's queenside structure. Reclaiming squares with the knight redirects the attack towards the queenside pressure, aiming to support the pawn advances and prevent black from solidifying their position. Seeking to activate the bishop and challenge the dominant knight on c3, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines for black's remaining pieces, hinting at a shift towards a more dynamic, less passive endgame. Capturing the pawn on a4 opens a dangerous diagonal for your rook and creates immediate threats against black's weakened queenside pawn structure, forcing a defensive response. The rook, now freed from its defensive post on the 8th rank, seeks active participation on the open file, aiming to pressure white's isolated pawn on a4 and potentially create dynamic counterplay. Capturing on e5 finally resolves the tension, creating an open diagonal for your bishop and potentially activating the rook on the 1st rank. Chasing the inactive rook pawn offers a temporary respite, but it neglects the fundamental need to organize your defensive pieces. Reasserting central influence, the knight relocates to a more active square, aiming to improve its reach and participate in potential pawn pushes or piece exchanges that could crack open the position. Unlocking the c-file after the pawn sacrifice and material exchange decisively shifts the balance towards white, opening avenues for tactical breakthroughs and pressure on black's exposed king.